Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie video, taken from the HFY subreddit. The story is called Diagnostics, written by TMarkos. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. In between the stars, where the light doesn't reach, it can get incredibly disorienting. Interestingly, this is something of a species constant. Even those who live primarily underground or off-world tend to have the same inborn sensitivity to light patterns. Many shun space travel for that reason. The darkness, the long solitude of space travel, causing stress and overstripping the benefit of the journey. Drumming his fingers on the side of his chair, Zach watched the stars through the viewport. To him, being out here was like weekends with his dad up in Montana. They'd had a cabin out there in the woods, so far away from all the conveniences of modern life. At night, with just the black woods and the stars out of the cabin, was a little flickering pool of light from the hurricane lamp. Outside of that bright circle, the black stretched on for uncountable miles, and the deadly cold crept into the space between them and everything else. So, despite being considered something of an undesirable job for most, Zach was rather relaxed by the transit. Muffled vibrations began to percolate through the ship, and the co-pilot paced up and down the main corridor again. Lal had no memories of weekends out by the Priest Lake, and made him relish in the dark and solitude. Zach was actually quite unclear as to why the little guy kept flying out here. He didn't seem to enjoy the job, nor did he particularly care for Zach's company. A few minutes later, the door to the cabin hissed open, and Lal skittered in. He was a Lal, not the same as his name, in theory, but to Zach's ears every word he uttered was binary oscillation of swallowing eyes and trilled vowel sounds, like Welsh, but somewhat more comprehensible. Since Zach was the only human out these parts, he figured that it was up to him if he wanted to abbreviate names for convenience. Lal didn't seem to care either way, since the contextual translator apparently passed Zach's speech into an acceptable format. Lal was something of an isopod, if those grew up to the size of a Labrador. Rather than the smooth, articulated shell of isopods on Earth, Lal bulged towards the front of his body into a thick, armored plates, 4 nimble, grasping arms protruding from either side of his head, somewhat ruining the resemblance. Still, despite looking like some Hieronymus Bosch sketch of a lobster, the vaguely Terran form factor gave him the look that Zach found nostalgic. There were certainly stranger things he had run into. After some time, Lal curled up into his own chair, turned his faceted eyes towards Zach, and began speaking. The ululations were masked by the noise-cancelling directional speakers that replaced smooth with fair imitation of Zach's own voice. "The reactor is down to 98% output," he stated. "I'm concerned we're experiencing a failure." Zach rolled his eyes. "Lal, how many times has the reactor dropped to that threshold in the last 5 trips?" Lal punched in the records on the data terminal. 27 times, Zach, but, Zach held up his hands. "Lal, how many of those times did you raise the same concern to me?" Lal brushed the sides of his head with his arms, which Zach had learned was Lal's equivalent of an exasperated sigh. 27 times, Zach, but, Zach reasserted his hand. "Lal, how many of those times did the reactor fail, sending us to die in the darkest space?" The arm brushing accelerated pace. "None," Lal trolled, "but it does not matter. You continue to cite past statistics, but they are not a valid predictor of the reactor's future performance. We must check the reactor immediately to ensure that it does not fail." Sighing, he leaned back in his chair. Lal, who had apparently figured out what sighing meant now, drew himself up higher and sat down in his seat and trolled indignantly. "Again, you shun basic safety protocols. What else are you doing that prevents you from running the diagnostic?" Zach shook his head and stood up and trudged to the entryway. "Come on then," he called out back to Lal. "Let's get this over with." The two of them went first to the equipment lockers to grab a system monitoring accessories, then to the reactor core to begin the assessment. "Lal," Zach said, hooking up the cables, "I'm curious about your species. Before you gained technology, how did your kind live?" Lal gave him an emotive reaction that Zach didn't have the interpretation for. "We lived underground," he said. "We had burrows that we used to defense and storage." Zach nodded. "And when you gained technology, did you move out of the burrows?" Lal chirped in negation. "We stayed in the burrows for a long time. When we developed chemistry and mathematics, we used them to make our burrows stronger, better. Only much later, when we were growing at a rate unsuitable for the subsurface construction, did we consider moving elsewhere. We still live primarily in burrows, although they're now similar in scale to most structures you'd find in other worlds. Zach's brows furrowed. Why did you take so long to expand? Surely there were surface resources you could make use of to grow more effectively. He handed Lal the last two probes and the monitor, watching as they passed between arms before finally interacting with the console. Straightening up again, Lal looked towards Zach. We certainly could have used the resources, but we were not able to effectively secure the surface until later. We are a smaller species on our world, and the surface was quite dangerous for us. Huh, said Zach. He turned to initiate the diagnostics, and the monitor lit up with blinking green lights. I will need to monitor at least one oscillation cycle to give us a full reading, he said as he settled into the seated position against the bulkhead. Lal perched on the console, cowling, his glassy black eyes fitting over Zach. I am not familiar with your species, Lal said after a few moments. How did they begin? Living in trees, tall, sturdy vegetation. Zach wasn't really that confident in his contextual translator's ability to handle Earth-specific terminology. We later moved on constructed shelters, then larger groups of those shelters. Lal chittered. A safer planet, then? Zach shook his head. No, not at all. In the region of the world where we began, there were many dangerous predators, and the weather can be harsh. More of Lal's eyes were looking at him now. Did you not use the burrows? Zach contemplated the question for a bit. Sometimes, I suppose, he said. We had cultures that lived in naturally occurring caves, or they utilized rock formations as shelters. Most didn't have that luxury, and were not naturally inclined to burrow. The monitor's soft beeping filled the room for a while as Lal processed this. Of the current generations, the descendants of the ones who found burrows and survived. Zach actually laughed at that one, startling Lal. No, he chuckled, something of the opposite. For most of our history, adversity and danger have been drivers of technological process. The cultures in inhospitable and dangerous areas tend to develop technology to mitigate the dangers. Lal cocked his head, which was one of the gestures that happened to mean the same thing between humans and Lal. And dogs, Zach supposed. My translation did not have the word for your last sentence, he said, tapping the personal display, another tap, and Zach heard himself saying, mitigate. Ah, Zach said, trying to figure out the alternative phrasing. It means very similar to reduce, but it also is mostly in context of reducing something that you would prefer to eliminate. Lal did the emotive reaction again. Puzzlement, maybe. How did these groups ensure safety and progress without controlling their home area? Zach laughed again. You're making me remember my history classes. The short answer is, they didn't. Much of the progress was made in incredibly unsafe and unhealthy conditions. Truly safe conditions are really only beginning to happen in the last 100 years, he paused, and Lal looked at him expectantly. A year is about 300 of my sleep cycles, he added. Lal's eyes focused intently, and a little bit of the unmasked trilling that Zach could hear sounded high-pitched. You said your world had been to space. The monitor beeped to indicate halfway point between the diagnostics, and Zach craned his neck to view the display. Yep, he drawled out, but not like this. An indignant chittering slipped past the masker. It should not matter. At that point where you can put objects into planetary orbit, by any means, you should be able to do something as simple as ensure stability of your species. Zach thought for a moment. Well, we probably could. I mean, we've got some weather that is on the tough side, but most of the rest is doable. He saw Lal mentally drafting another tirade and waved him off. I think the main reason we haven't is that we've got other priorities to take precedence. Infrastructure buildings are always near the top of our list, but normally not the primary focus. In fact, we normally only see pushes in development if necessary to support other projects like spaceflight. Lal seemed to be at a loss of words, which made the tone of the monitor a welcome interruption. They both busied themselves scanning the diagnostics, and Zach eventually found a slight error on the containment field that was causing the inefficiency. The error corrected, both of them turned to walk back to the main deck. See? No fatal loss of power. Zach dinged Lal on the carapace with a finger, while Lal chirped in irritation. You could not know, he said sullenly. It would not be logical to leave the floor unaddressed. Zack shrugged. Perhaps not, but I've never considered myself a logical person. From the look on Lal's face, he figured the humor didn't translate well. Some time passed. There was no communication in transit, no schedule to keep aside from the minimal maintenance check. Zack had heard multiple versions of the reasons these flights were crewed at all. Some said that the rule was applied after pressure from the pilots' union. Others that the corporate hierarchs and the reluctant to give AIs complete control of a fusion drive vessel. Whatever the reason, it meant that for weeks at a stretch, a couple of Sophons had to coast through the featureless space to reach the next bright mote of light. Zack figured that he'd seen more individual stars in systems than any other human, even if there were others out there. He was working, for a change, one of the day's 15-minute maintenance reviews. As usual, everything was fine. He made the requisite notes in the log and leaned back in his chair, stretching. Han Solo, he was not. The door hissed and the cascade of tapping heralded Lal flowing in towards his seat in the bridge. It should be time for the scheduled maintenance, he said. Is everything nominal? Zack sighed. Yes, Lal, as with the previous check. Lal, as all the translator really, was getting better at interpreting human tones. The dead-eyed monotony of Zack's reply sent him bristling up the back of the center chair, eyes flickering in annoyance. If there was not a chance the data would change, they would not have us check more than once. He took his own display in grasping arms and waved it at Zack's face. The interval for these checks was decided based on billions of runtime hours, rigorously analyzed. Zack laughed, which sent Lal's trills into an irritated register octaves above what the translator could reliably interpret. Fuming, Lal curled up in his chair and pointedly looked at everything on the bridge that wasn't Zack. No mean feat for Lal, since his visual field was rather all-encompassing. Zack shook his head. Look, Lal, I'm not arguing against the performing of the check. I did the checks because I know it's important. I'm just saying that there's no need to get so stressed about the details. If something goes wrong, there are systems to tell us the fault, and we can fix basically anything on the ship that goes wrong if it doesn't kill us instantly. Lal twitched. Besides, he continued, you just mentioned these junkers have billions of hours of logged runtime, which is enough that every statistical probable outcome has been logged, analyzed, and had an intelligent monitor designed to guard against it. I suppose it's possible that we'd find something new here or there, but the odds are against it are impressively low. Slightly mollified, Lal relaxed down into his chair. His eyes, however, always had a partial fix on the visible diagnostic panels. Some of them swiveled to look back at Zack. Your logic is sound, but it does not remove the danger. How can one relax knowing that any moment could be his last, no matter how small the odds? Zack leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide as a way of example. Like this, man, he said, shimmering in his seat to convey unrealistic, relaxing pose. You just have to accept that there are certain thresholds past which life doesn't get any more certain. Back on your home planet, did you ever worry about getting struck by lightning? Ionized electrical discharge from water vapor in the atmosphere. Lal stared for a moment. This happens with regularity on your world. Nodding, Zack sketched out a path of the bolt of lightning with his fingers. The lightning part, yeah. Actually, striking a person is rare enough that it's a common metaphor for improbable occurrences. Insanity, Lal rasped, his legs quivering in distaste. Besides, even if such a thing happened on my world, we live underground, so it would not affect us. Zack leaned forward. Okay, how about a meteor strike? Underground, replied Lal, fixing Zack with a stare that seemed to imply a concern of his mental well-being. Big meteor strike, then. Orbital debris monitoring satellites. We'd see anything substantial enough to damage habitat coming. Zack pinched the bridge of his nose. Fine, catastrophic ground tremors. Lal actually flinched. What sort of death trap did he come from? Our world was geologically stable for 1 billion years before we developed as a species. Now it was Zack's turn to furrow his brows in thought. With the stable tectonics, did your planet have a magnetosphere? How did you handle coronal mass ejections and flares? The same way that anyone else does. We shield our electronics, Lal replied. The effect is mildly attenuated on the planet, but not so much that you could keep sensitive equipment unshielded. He tilted his head. Did your planet have a large magnetosphere? I suppose so, Zack said. Our sun is fairly active, and I understand that without the magnetosphere, a direct hit from a flare would prove quite lethal. Even in the place was occasional flares that impact the surface equipment. Lal squatted in disbelief, insomuch as mandibles could splatter, but was prevented from responding when Zack suddenly sat upright and held his hand out for silence. The tenor of the normal shipboard noise had shifted almost imperceptibly, the interleaving of the sounds too complex to easily tell what had changed. To Zack's ears, it just sounded wrong, different, like someone singing a song that you knew in a different lyrics. "What is it?" asked Lal, sliding out of the chair and looking around. "I don't see anything wrong on the status display." Zack shook his head. "Not sure," he said, "but keep quiet for a bit. The maskers make it harder to hear soft noises." He rose from the chair and paced back to the back of the cabin, and then to the front. After several long seconds he turned again and strode through the entryway towards the aft of the ship. Lal followed along as he slowly moved back, pausing to listen and check the displays as he went. They ended back at the reactor room, where the noise finally separated into a faint but a distinct vibration coming from the primary feed line for the reactor. Zack pointed at the line, and Lal grabbed the monitor from the stowage and ran a quick check on the thick, padded pipe. "Looks like a constriction in the intake," he said agitatedly. "Some sort of charge buildup. It's not impacting the flow rate, but it is accelerating the intake velocity. If it worsens, it could dramatically destabilize the plasma." Zack nodded. "That's probably why we saw the efficiency drop earlier. The increase was enough to knock out the reactor part of optimal. We'll have to slowly return the containment settings to default while degaussing the intake line." Lal ducked his head twice rapidly and then scuttled off to grab the appropriate kit for the intake. For his part, Zack called up the standard containment configuration on the reactor. Over the next hour or two, they slowly released the charge from the intake and eased the reactor back to normal. By the end, Lal's legs were twitching with fatigue from his awkward perch atop the pipe, and Zack's shoulders ached from hunching over the tiny display. But the reactor hummed, all settings reverted to normal, and no errors to be found. As they ate with a celebratory meal afterwards, Zack caught Lal staring at him with more of his eyes than usual. "What is it, man?" Lal was silent for a few moments before speaking. "How did you know? The diagnostics didn't indicate an intake problem, and the reactor was running without errors. Yet the constriction could have led to a complete destabilization before the next regular check." Zack shrugged. "Sounded off," he said. "Couldn't say what in particular." That earned him more eyes. "So you're saying that the non-specific audio cue was barely noticeable, even when concentrating, and yet you noticed it and categorized it as a serious issue, in the middle of a conversation with the maskers active." Lal chittered, grooving his mandibles over his inner pair of arms. "This seems like a contradiction." "Maybe," said Zack, "but that's not so strange. Sometimes something just feels off, you know." He looked at Lal, who did not know. Frowning, he tried to explain. "You said you guys live in habitats underground, very safe and protected." Lal ducked his head, and Zack pressed on. "Okay, then consider this. How do you think that you would feel on my planet, on the surface, if you had to live out there all the time, I mean?" Lal looked at him sickly, as if he contemplated the concept. "I think I would be dead almost immediately from your descriptions. The short time before my demise would be unpleasant." Zack laughed. "Come on, man, don't sell yourself short. I just tell you about the exciting parts. There's plenty of relaxing stuff, too. But yeah, it is a bit more dangerous out in the middle of nowhere than in one of your burrows. You'd feel stressed out living out there." Lal cracked loudly. "To say the least," he muttered. "So then imagine that you don't think about the danger so much. Imagine that you've got some sort of diagnostic system in your sensory feeds, just like the reactor, that's tuned to all the dangers and things around you. The infrasound before an earthquake, the static charge of lightning, the sound and smell of a predator behind you. Imagine the part of you that thinks doesn't get all that sensory data raw, but through a diagnostic program that alerts and warnings." Lal scoffed. "Oh, come on! You can't expect me to believe that you've got some sort of internal diagnostic software to alert you to danger." Grinning, Zack sat forward. "No, nothing that scientific or reliable, but there's an aspect to human thought that we call the subconscious. Undermined? Since that's probably not going to translate. We don't understand it very well, even now, but it lets us register and process things that would be distracting if we focused on them all the time. We also call it intuition or a gut feeling." And this subconscious was enough to allow you to recognize the dangerous and unprecedented impeding system's failure better than a ship's diagnostics. Lal bobbed his head back and forth skeptical. I just don't see how it could do it better than the system designed to catch very errors from the sole purpose. Hey, I don't know how it works any more than you do, Zack said with a shrug. But it's always on, and brother, we've got a heck of a lot more than a few billion hours of collective runtime under our belts. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.